World War II did not arrive suddenly. It crept into the world slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, while most people were too tired, too hopeful, or too afraid to stop it. By the time the first shots were fired, the war had already been decided in the hearts and minds of nations that felt betrayed, humiliated, and forgotten. To understand why the deadliest war in human history truly happened, we must look beyond dates and battles and into the emotional collapse of the modern world. After World War I ended in 1918, Europe was exhausted. Millions were dead, empires had collapsed, and an entire generation was traumatized. Leaders promised that this war had been the last one humanity would ever fight. But peace was not built on healing, it was built on punishment. The Treaty of Versailles did not just defeat Germany, it humiliated it. The country was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, stripped of territory, crushed economically, and forbidden from defending itself. For politicians, this was justice. For ordinary Germans, it was collective shame. German families watched their savings disappear as inflation spiraled out of control. Veterans who had survived trench warfare returned home to unemployment and hunger. Parents could not feed their children. The democratic government struggled to function while extremist voices grew louder. When people feel abandoned by their leaders and mocked by the world, anger becomes more powerful than reason. Germany did not become dangerous because it lost the war. It became dangerous because it lost dignity. This pattern was not limited to Germany. Across Europe, old empires had fallen, but new democracies were fragile and unstable. In Italy, resentment over unmet war promises fueled nationalism. In Eastern Europe, borders were redrawn without regard for ethnic realities, creating tension everywhere. The world was unstable, and stability was desperately needed. Then came the Great Depression. In 1929, the global economy collapsed almost overnight. American banks failed, international trade collapsed, and the crisis spread worldwide. In Germany, unemployment exploded. In the United States, breadlines stretched across cities. In Asia and Europe, desperation replaced optimism. Democracy, once seen as the future, now looked weak and ineffective. People stopped asking which system was fair and started asking which system worked. In times of crisis, extreme ideas flourish. Leaders who spoke calmly were ignored. Leaders who shouted were followed. Fascism promised order. Militarism promised strength. Nationalism promised pride. These ideas did not arrive as villains, they arrived as solutions. Adolf Hitler understood this reality better than anyone. He was not a military genius or an economic expert. He was a master of emotion. Hitler spoke to fear, resentment, and wounded pride. He told Germans that they were victims of betrayal, that enemies inside and outside the country had stolen their greatness. He offered simple answers to complex problems and demanded absolute loyalty in return. Once Hitler gained power, Germany changed rapidly. Political opposition disappeared. Independent media was crushed. Children were educated to obey. Propaganda turned lies into truth through repetition. Germany rearmed openly, daring the world to respond. But the world hesitated. Britain and France, still haunted by World War I, chose appeasement. They believed that giving Hitler what he wanted would prevent another catastrophe. Instead, each concession convinced him that no one would stop him. When Germany absorbed Austria and dismantled Czechoslovakia, the message was clear. Treaties were meaningless if force went unchallenged. The invasion of Poland in 1939 was not the beginning of World War II. It was the moment denial became impossible. As Europe descended into war, another storm was gathering in the East. The Soviet Union, ruled by Joseph Stalin, was a land of fear and control. Millions had already died in purges, forced labor camps, and famines. Stalin distrusted everyone. He signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler not out of friendship, but necessity. It bought time. When Germany eventually invaded the Soviet Union, the attack was devastating. Entire armies were destroyed. Cities were encircled. Civilians starved. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. The war became a brutal fight for survival. The scale of suffering was unimaginable. Soldiers fought without food, without rest, without mercy. Civilians endured sieges that lasted years. The Eastern Front consumed lives at a rate the world had never seen. It was here that Hitler's ambition began to break. Meanwhile, Western Europe fell quickly. France collapsed. Britain stood alone. Many believed resistance was pointless. But Winston Churchill refused surrender. He understood that morale could decide history. His speeches did not promise safety, they promised struggle. Britain endured relentless bombing, but it survived. That survival mattered. It kept hope alive and gave future allies a base from which to fight back. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched carefully. Americans wanted peace, but the world was shrinking. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that isolation was an illusion. He supported allies quietly while preparing the nation for a war he believed was inevitable. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the debate ended. America entered the war with unmatched industrial power and growing resolve. Japan's path to war had begun long before 1941. Imperial Japan believed expansion was essential for survival. Resources, territory, and national honor drove its leaders. Asia suffered under occupation marked by brutality and violence. Pearl Harbor was intended to eliminate American interference. Instead, it unified a nation. World War II became a global conflict where factories mattered as much as battlefields. Science transformed warfare. Intelligence, technology, and production determined victory. Civilians became targets. Cities burned from the air. The war erased the line between soldier and civilian. At the heart of the conflict was ideology. Fascism demanded obedience and purity. Communism demanded control and sacrifice. Democracy demanded unity and resilience. Each system claimed to represent humanity's future. The cost of these competing visions was paid in blood. The Holocaust revealed the darkest truth of the war. Genocide was not chaos. It was organized, planned, and executed by a modern state. Millions were murdered not for what they had done, but for who they were. The world learned too late what happens when hatred becomes law. As the war neared its end, victory came with a terrible price. Europe lay in ruins. Asia burned. Atomic weapons introduced humanity to a new fear: instant annihilation. The war ended, but innocence did not return. World War II happened because economic collapse met wounded pride, because fear silenced reason, because leaders chose power over humanity, and because too many people believed it could not happen again. It remains the clearest warning in history. Civilization is fragile, and peace requires courage long before war begins. This story is not just about the past. It is a reminder that the forces which created World War II, fear, inequality, silence, and unchecked power, still exist. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. And whether those echoes become another catastrophe depends on what humanity chooses to remember.